Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for tuning in for this incredibly unique broadcast. I'm Sarah Tuttle-Singer, new media editor at Times of Israel, and I am thrilled to be hosting this conversation tonight with our media partners, the Jewish News in the UK, Atlanta Jewish Times, and Australian Jewish News. This conversation covers 4 continents. We are reaching across the time zones. I believe it is tomorrow in Australia. This is remarkable. During a time of turning inward, of social distancing, of isolation, we are so lucky to be able to connect like this and have a community like this. Thank you so much for being here. Please join me in welcoming Kayleen Ladinsky from Atlanta Jewish Times, Richard Farrer from the Jewish News in the UK, Zeddy Lawrence from Australian Jewish News, and David Horovitz from the Times of Israel. Kayleen, Richard, Zeddy, and David, thank you for being here, and I would love it if you could tell us a little bit about your newspaper and your community of readers. Kayleen, would you please begin?
Sure. My name is Kayleen Ladinsky. I am currently the managing publisher and editor of the Atlanta Jewish Times. The Atlanta Jewish Times has been around and began publishing in 1925. Our current community has about 150,000 American Jews, which reside in the greater Atlanta area. We currently print anywhere from 12,500 to 15,000 copies per week, and our readership is continued to grow, especially over the last 2 years. The Atlanta Jewish Times is currently owned by Michael Morris, which he had purchased the newspaper in 2014, at the end of the year. And I have currently had the privilege to serve under the previous owner as well, and have been here for just about 10 years. Our community is thriving. The Atlanta Jewish community is probably about the 8th largest Jewish community in the United States. And I'm very proud that the newspaper has been and continued to be a communication hub for our community.
Richard, tell us a little bit about your community.
Thanks, Sarah. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. It's lovely to be here. I'm Richard Farrer, the editor of the Jewish News. I've been the editor for about 11 years now. My co-panelist Zeddy there, who's now in Australia, edited it before me, and then I came along and just made it a tad more upmarket. We publish about 21,000 copies. Are you smiling, Zeddy? No. We publish about 21,000 copies. Unfortunately, it's a few less now because of the virus and the lockdown. We haven't been able to deliver to synagogues. My goal is, to break exclusive stories, and by doing so, to be at the centre of editorially and commercially Jewish life in Britain, I suppose. And we do that, we have to do that now by being so much more than a newspaper. We do events, we do Simcha shows, we do Jewish Living Expo, we do a Night of Heroes, we do a daily digital newspaper edition, we do a weekly podcast. We do as much as we can. We sponsor dozens of events each year. And we have turned ourselves into not only the most read newspaper for the community in the UK, but also the biggest digital brand, thanks to our partnership with Times of Israel. We're approaching 1.5 million page views a month, which is an astonishing feat. And that is really part of the challenge for us ahead, especially during the virus. 50 or so local newspapers have folded in the last couple of months due to coronavirus. The largest printer in the country has had to furlough 1,000 staff. We are facing unprecedented times when it comes. My cat's just veering into shot now, so I'm just going to put him down.
Not like that.
So no, not like that. Bugger off. So we are about bringing the community together digitally. We've got a kids' fun day this Sunday. We do Havdalah Live on a Saturday night. We do all sorts of things that bring the community together. So my job is to develop that digital platform for the Jewish News while still retaining our core loyal print readership.
I'm actually an avid viewer of your Havdalah Live. I really enjoy that feature. Zeddy, tell us a little bit about your newspaper.
Well, thank you for having me, and good morning from Australia, where the kangaroos are hopping past our window. I'm afraid to say, Richard, I've never watched your Havdalah ceremony because it's about 6 o'clock in the morning here. If you make it a little later, I'll watch it. We in Australia are a community of about 110,000 people, the majority of whom are split between Melbourne and Sydney, about 45,000 in each. The rest are spread around the country. You've got communities of a few thousand in Adelaide, Brisbane, and Perth. We publish 2 editions each week, one in Melbourne and one in Sydney, those being the main hubs of the community. Our mission is to inform, educate, entertain, and campaign on behalf of the community. And it's quite a diverse community. We have native-born Australians, we have people from England, we have people from South Africa, we have people from Russia, and we are also the largest community of Holocaust survivors outside of Israel. So we have thousands upon thousands of members of the community who survived the camps in Eastern Europe. As I said, we are here to unite the community, to bring all these diverse people together, and that means finding common ground. And one key area of common ground is obviously support for Israel. We're proudly a Zionist newspaper. That means that while we're free to criticize the actions of the Israeli government, we will stand up for Israel when other media don't. The AJN was founded about 125 years ago. Prior to that, it was known as the Hebrew Standard. It's one of the oldest continuously published Jewish newspapers in the world. We produce about 15,000 copies each week, as I said, mostly distributed between Sydney and Melbourne. And I'm proud to say that despite the setbacks of the coronavirus and despite the fact that a load of other regional newspapers and local newspapers around Australia have ceased publication, we're still going strong.
David, tell us a little bit about Times of Israel.
So yeah, hi everybody. I'm in the office and it's 20 to 11 at night, but I just reckon the internet connection's probably best here. It's really a pleasure to do this, and it's a pleasure to do it with 3 fellow editors, some of whom I know better than others, but it's really lovely to do it, and it's a mark of the way we can all communicate these days, which is great. I don't know where people are watching, but I'm sure around the world. And that's a lovely thing. And in a way, that's why we set up the Times of Israel, which is, I guess, the newest of the titles represented here. It was set up about 8 and a bit years ago to try and report Israel fairly and the Jewish world and the region. We run 24/7. It never stops except Yom Kippur. We publish in, our core language is English, but we also publish in French, in Arabic, and in Persian. And last year, almost exactly a year ago, we set up a Hebrew site called Zaman Yisrael. Again, the goal being to report what's going on here with a fair mindset. We have, as do all of our colleagues here, we have a blog platform which offers a really diverse take on everything, multiple opinions on almost every subject. And the core of the site is reporting. And I'm sure all my colleagues share this sense. We're proudest of the original reporting that we do when we're breaking ground, when we're enabling people to understand what's going on in ways that perhaps they wouldn't be able to otherwise. I think what we are all doing is incredibly important. There is so much misinformation. There is so much manipulation, and I'm sure that we all have that common goal of enabling people to understand, giving them information, breaking ground, entertaining, educating. I love a lot of the things that Zeddy said just there. Very successfully, we are, in the last few months when the virus has evidently left a lot of people with a lot more time to read stuff online. Our traffic is, even higher than it commonly is, about 8, 9, 10 million unique users in the last 2-3 months, 50, 60 million page views per month in the last couple of months. These are staggeringly high numbers. That they'll go down again, please God, sooner, I have to say, because hopefully this pandemic will dissipate, or will at least be reduced in its impact. But we have this incredibly high traffic. Obviously, a great many of our readers are from the Jewish community. A fair number, a growing number, I'm sure, beyond as well.
Thank you, David. And thank you, Richard, and thank you, Kayleen and Zeddy. Now, these are incredibly challenging times across the world, and journalism is a necessary conduit of information. But I know that the nature of reporting has changed in the face of this crisis. Could you speak a little bit about how COVID-19 has changed how you work? David, why don't we start with you?
Well, first of all, from the actual practical mechanism side, journalists in Israel have been allowed to work as usual during this crisis, but it's a risky business. A potentially risky business for sure. Our reporters are no different from other people. We have had reporters who are quarantined because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. We have people for whom it has been difficult to go out and report, and there's a sensible reluctance, certainly at the height a few weeks ago, to go to areas that were potentially where there was a potential risk of infection and contagion. So there's a great deal more work that's been done, via camera, via Zoom, via the phone, and so on. In terms of some of the things that we've tried to stress, it's staggering to me. And again, I think most people watching this will share this feeling. We're 3 months into this pandemic, and there is still so much that is not known. And even when you think you know stuff, turns out you don't. You think you can't get reinfected. You think that, there's an Israeli statistics professor who we've written about, says basically this peaks after 40 days and disappears after 70. There seems to be quite a lot of credibility to that argument, but it's not as black and white as that. We think it doesn't mutate, except, well, maybe it does mutate, but not in a way that makes it more dangerous. We don't think, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things that we've tried to do here is to distinguish between the sensationalist and inaccurate in many cases, and things that are credible. So, when the defense minister says that Israel's ahead of the world in terms of antibody treatment, well, was that credible? Apparently fairly credible. We've reported it in that way. Other claims that have been made about vaccines and about cures and so on, we've tried to enable people to understand, to distinguish between the really genuine breakthrough sensational stuff and the actually people overhyping and people misleading. We've done a lot of interviews with experts, including we went 3 times to one of the medical experts who's helped shape Israeli government policy. And we've asked him every few weeks a new series of questions. And those pieces you see resonate because they're credible, because when he doesn't know stuff, he says so. I did a really interesting story for me. I have to say, I went to a Hebrew University lab where a guy who's an expert, who's been trying to tackle coronavirus for years, is, the way he put it to me, throwing drugs at the proteins that constitute this virus, and just trying to understand how they're trying to find treatments and that process. And I think that's been a very important part of our focus. And just one more thing, obviously lots and lots of resources moved away from other issues to covering, this common concern for so many people. So a lot of resources reallocated to try and cover aspects of the virus.
Pauline, how has the COVID-19 crisis changed where you work?
Well, obviously, the fact of us having to mobilize in such a quick period of time, and that's the entire staff. For the Atlanta Jewish Times, most of our publication prior to the COVID was in our print edition, and identifying how to get the print paper or our particular publication in the hands of our readers became a difficult challenge that we had to overcome, simply because all the businesses that we currently were stacking our paper, they closed down. In addition to that, I think that, changing from just covering our local feature stories and things that were happenings in our community turned into us kind of having to dig a little deeper into social issues and engagement and keeping our community updated on closures, openings, places where they could, go to identify curbside dining, letting them know about, our community center closing, jobs that were declining. As well as, letting our community know about the health and concerns of some of our local community members. Our content output has tripled in the last couple of months. We're now publishing more content online that we don't even consider publishing in the newspaper. And this is something that, I think has actually increased our business model as a newspaper, because at this point, I don't see us ever going backwards. I see that the Atlanta Jewish Times will continue to move forward in, you know, printing stories online and content online that we won't publish in our print edition, getting our news out there sooner. One of the benefits of being a part of the Times of Israel community is the syndication, which was something that I would, you know, ever commonly pull a few stories here or there and get them out into our community. I found that that's something that that we've been able to take advantage of over the last couple of months and has definitely helped our readership. So I think just kind of getting used to being mobilized and more virtual and more timely online has been the biggest step that we have taken.
Zeddy, are you noticing similar trends in your work and how it's changing? Or is there anything else that you've had to do to adapt to the COVID-19 crisis in your work with the newspaper?
Well, I have to be honest with you, Sarah, and the rest of you. This year, 2020, has been one crisis after another as far as Australia is concerned and the Australian Jewish community is concerned. We started the year with terrible bushfires that consumed half the country, which made international headlines. That was January. Right at the beginning of February, just a few days after the bushfires started to settle down, the CEO of the Australian Jewish News, who'd actually been a journalist with the newspaper for 9 years and a very dear friend of mine, passed away, which came as a shock not just to staff, but the entire Jewish community. A couple of weeks later, we had Reuven Rivlin in the country, which was a huge moment for the Australian Jewish community, again, making national and international headlines. And just as Reuven Rivlin was here, coronavirus struck. And it was while he was here that Israel started introducing restrictions on who could enter Israel. And there was a big question mark, would Reuven Rivlin be stuck in Australia or would he actually be able to return to Jerusalem? And no sooner had Reuven Rivlin left Australia than the shutdown over here began. We as a country have been much more fortunate than many other countries, whereas in other countries you hear of thousands and tens of thousands of people dying. Over here so far, God willing and thank God, the death toll across the entire country has just so far been about 97 people. Nonetheless, we have been in lockdown for the past 8 or 9 weeks. And as a result, as a newspaper, we've had to adapt. If you're not allowed, if you don't need to leave home, don't leave home. If you can work from home, work from home. And that's what we've been doing. So the biggest challenge for me as an editor and for my staff has been not having a physical office space to work from. All our conferences are done via Zoom or phone calls. We haven't seen each other for weeks on end. The biggest surprise, I think, for me, is that we've actually survived and are still able to produce a newspaper. I thought when coronavirus hit, there'd be no more stories to write about. I thought the world would shut down. After a couple of weeks of writing about coronavirus, I thought coronavirus fatigue would set in and nobody would be interested in anything that we had to write anymore. But the community, surprisingly, still managed to function. They moved to being online. There were events online. The speakers who used to come from overseas, they were doing their speeches via Zoom. So the community has kept going and there have still been stories to write about. So the biggest impact on the newspaper has been 2 things. One, working from home and liaising with people via Zoom or just via phone. And the other one is, unfortunately, we used to have every week an 8-page pullout in the newspaper of photos from events from around the community. But we didn't think just having Zoom screenshots would fill that space. So at the moment, we've gone down in size because we've lost that 8-page pullout.
Well, it's a lot of challenges. And yes, thank you for reminding us about the terrible fires that you endured. Your community has really been hit twice in a very short amount of time. Richard, any other challenges that you're facing with the Jewish news in the UK in terms of COVID-19 and reporting?
Yeah, it's been unprecedented, hasn't it? The biggest news story for 75 years, and we've all just commemorated VE Day. I can't think of a bigger event that has affected so many people since that time. And so the need for quality journalism has never been greater. The need for analysis, the need for experts to give their opinions has never been greater. And that is really where I see the Jewish News' role. Now, it's very strange. I haven't seen any of my colleagues now since early March. So we are that we've changed in so many ways. I mean, it would have been unthinkable to think we couldn't actually have a physical hub. I've always thought for 25 years a newspaper is the energy of the people around it, and it's the gossip at the water cooler, and it's the throng of the office and the busyness. But we've managed to conduct this orchestra from far apart on Zoom meetings every morning. So it is feasible that we could continue now without an office, or maybe just with a hub. The responsibility of the Jewish News has been profound. As you alluded to, the virus has hit the Jewish community hard. We're 0.4% of the UK, and we're something like 2.5% of overall fatalities. I think the current figure announced today was something like 384. So the need to pay tribute to the people that have died, to tell their stories, to explain their lives, and also the implications of what the virus is doing from the very start, when the stories started to emerge that you couldn't kiss the mezuzah or kiss the Torah, to now where synagogues have been shut for something like 2 months. Charities are not surviving and are having to go into special measures. Our schools are shut. There are stories of Jewish medics on the front line that we're telling. One particularly that went up only yesterday has just caught the public's imagination here in the UK. So as I said, the need for that quality reporting, especially when there's a disproportionate impact in terms of this virus and what the havoc it's wreaking on our readers, is extraordinary. And me and my team have really stepped up to the plate. We've found it professionally an important mission that we're on now. It's not just a job now. It's something that I think emotionally we're all engaged in, and we work very, very hard to deliver in very difficult circumstances on an hourly basis online and every Thursday in print.
Thank you. And I know that the UK has really been disproportionately hit by the virus in terms of the Jewish community, and it's remarkable the work that you're doing to keep people connected. And I'm hoping that you can actually speak a little bit more about what's happening in the UK in terms of COVID-19 at this point. Put us in the picture about what's going on.
Well, I mean, the Prime Minister is facing huge criticism. Obviously, it's a very, very difficult, fast-moving story, and it's very easy to work from hindsight and say what could have been and should have been. There will be a lowering, I think, of the lockdown in the coming weeks as people are allowed to actually visit their loved ones, and people that can't work from remotely are able to go to work. That will not mean that Jewish life in this country returns to anything like normal. Synagogues will remain shut probably until at least July. My expectation, and those are the Jewish community leaders, is that people can't really imagine even going to synagogue for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur this year. There was a directive by the chief rabbi only a few weeks ago for the Seder, that Seders couldn't be done remotely, which I thought was a little bit dispassionate, a little bit unfair, but people are actually struggling as best they can to maintain their Jewish life. Talking about the terrible loss of life, there have been issues on burials, there's been issues on saying Kaddish and sitting Shiva. We're having to really just make this thing up as we go along in terms of the Jewish community. The Jewish community is online now. I am not a religious man, but I am more engaged in my Jewish identity now than ever, because I'll dip in to a Jewish talk or a Jewish sin song or a Limud conference that was taking place over the weekend. Jewish life is vibrant, and it finds ways to excel and express itself in ways that constantly amaze me. So there's a lot of concern on a national level about people not adhering to the lockdown and the government advice. And on a community level, people really are excelling and stepping up.
Well, it's wonderful to hear that. I'm glad that there is that sense of community and people are adhering to the rules and supporting one another. Kayleen, what's happening in America?
Well, in America, we have 1.3 million current cases of COVID. There's been over 78,000 deaths. So I think that, all of America has been brutally devastated by the loss of life and the health crisis. I think one of the most important things for Americans right now, as we're watching the numbers continue to climb, and that for us to be cognizant of what we're reading online and in the news, because I think that, you know, the numbers are continuing to go up because testing throughout the United States of the COVID virus has increased, as well as has become very accessible to everyone. And the more testing we do, the higher the numbers go up. I think one of the most interesting things that I've currently been watching is the death rate of the virus. That kind of gives us a good gauge as to, you know, where the virus is actually heading. Because at the point where the deaths are starting to decline and the percentage of deaths are declining, then that gives us an idea as to whether the virus is actually slowing. Our peak, we did peak with, I think it was over 43,000 COVID cases. I believe it was on April 9th. The states throughout the United States have now began opening their business, opening for business. Georgia is currently open for business. And we were only on a shelter in place. I think it was from April, let's see here, April 9th is when we first went into shelter in place. And it lasted until the end of April. Governor Kemp himself had opened up certain types of businesses towards the last week of April. So I think across the U.S. they're taking this in phases, where, you know, phase one is that they release the shelter in place and there's certain types of businesses that open. Right now, restaurants are opening. People are going out to eat. They're not having public gatherings that are they have to remain less than 10. And they're asking that people wear masks when they go out in public. Of course, you know, they're also telling you to stay 6 feet away from everyone. I think as far as the Jewish community is concerned, there's two main concerns in the United States, and that's number one, our economy, and number two, the devastation on our education system right now. You know, here in the near future, we have Jewish camps. And I think that, and at least in America, one of the greatest factors of all Jews in holding with their Jewish identity is their experience at camp. And that's not something that they can really gain the same richness of that experience virtually. So I think that's one of the things that we're trying to figure out here in the US that's become a top priority.
I know the camp experience is a big one for a sense of community and also Jewish continuity. And I'm looking forward to hearing how you solve that crisis, and I hope that there will be good news on that front. Zeddy, I know that Australia is entering its winter season, and epidemiologists warn that the virus tends to thrive in cold weather. And how is your community adapting to that?
Well, as I said earlier, so far in the country, just 97 people have died from the coronavirus. And whereas you hear in other countries of tens of thousands or thousands of people contracting the virus, in Australia, we're talking about it just being in hundreds. Now, the question is, as you referenced, is it because we've been in summer over here and therefore haven't been hit as badly as the rest of the world? Or is it because our government acted quickly in imposing a lockdown, closing the borders and introducing quarantine? So the big question is, will it get worse now as we're getting into winter? And will it get worse now as we're talking about lifting restrictions? For about 6 or 7 weeks now, we've only been able to get together 2 people at a time. We haven't been able to visit friends or family. Schools closed just before it was mandatory for them to close down. And the virus was contained. But now, as we're heading into winter, as the restrictions are being eased, or at least there's talk about the restrictions being eased, there is a fear that things might get a whole lot worse and we might see a second wave, and figures and statistics echoing what we've seen in Europe and America. But as I said, they are now talking about easing restrictions, and as of yesterday, there is talk about schools reopening after about 7 or 8 weeks. New restrictions are being introduced in different states in different ways across the country. In Victoria, where I live, which is where Melbourne is, as of midnight tonight, religious gatherings and ceremonies will be permitted with up to 10 people, plus those required to perform the ceremony. Now, that obviously means if you can have 10 people, you can have a minyan. And we're waiting for the schools to decide now, does that mean they will open? How will they organize it so only 10 people come? Will you have to book in advance to come to shul? Or is it still too much of a risk? Will it be that schools stay closed until even more restrictions are lifted and more people are allowed to gather? But again, for weddings, you're now allowed now to have 10 guests plus the couple and the celebrant. For funerals, you're allowed now to have 20 people at an indoor ceremony and 30 people at the outdoor ceremony. So finally, there is talk about Jewish life returning to normal. But as we're talking about Jewish life and life in general returning to normal, there is this big fear hanging over us that winter is just around the corner and that the figures of those affected by the virus are going to skyrocket.
Well, I hope that the trend of low numbers will continue, and please let us know if there's any way that we can be of help and of support. Now, David, as we begin to move out of lockdown here in Israel, can you describe for those tuning in what's happening here and what's the general mood out on the streets as the shops begin to open up?
Yeah, sure. First of all, it's just so interesting hearing, from places so far away, how different the experiences are. Maybe we're all on the same curve, but it's, the Australian experience is so different from the American and the British and from ours. We shut down early. We were, I think, the first country to advise, or one of the first to advise people against non-essential travel, and then to close the border essentially to almost everybody except returning Israelis and people whose lives are here, and they had to quarantine for 14 days. That was a big plus. I think Netanyahu scared Israelis. He compared this to the Spanish flu, and he said, potentially he intimated that this could kill tens of millions of people around the world. And even if people thought that was an exaggeration and people didn't know what to make of it, when he then said, so stay home and the best way to show you love your parents and your grandparents is to stay away from them, people took that very seriously. We've had pretty clear messaging from the top. And then I would add the one other factor that was a big plus here was the digital tracking of carriers. Now, it's controversial because basically the government has access to all of our movements, but it meant that if it turned out 5 days later that you'd been unwittingly close to someone who proved to be a carrier, you'd get an SMS on your phone telling you to self-quarantine. The reason that we have 260 dead as opposed to an even lower figure is communication with the ultra-Orthodox community wasn't as effective as it should be, and therefore it took a little longer for that sector of the demographic to get the message. That was a big factor. There were other factors as well. There are some minor sort of stubborn extremists. Right now, the lead headline on our site is about hundreds of Haredim crowding the streets of Jerusalem to celebrate Lag BaOmer. You're not supposed to be out celebrating Lag BaOmer. So that's set things back a little bit, but it's relatively minor, the extremism. Overall, we seem to have done very well. And when we compare it to the Spains and the Italys and the Britons, we think, wow, we did great. And then when we hear about other countries in this region, the Greeces and the Cypruses, and we look at Australia, we wonder, well, is it a climate thing? And in that case, are we not through the worst? So again, all of those uncertainties. I would just, a couple other things I think are worth stressing. All Israelis who've ever dealt with the health service here, which is all Israelis, know that our healthcare systems are staffed by ultra-Orthodox and secular and Jews and Arabs. You can't go to an Israeli hospital or get into an Israeli ambulance without meeting the whole mix of society amid the medical professionals. I think the world has kind of marveled. Oh my goodness. I mean, the iconic image for Israel of this pandemic is the Magen David Adom ambulance crew outside a hospital, one praying towards Mecca and his colleague praying towards Jerusalem in opposite directions. I mean, that it's if there's any comfort is that people maybe understood a little bit more about the fabric of Israeli society. And I think as a society, you beat the pandemic with mutual trust. If people don't take precautions together, then everybody's vulnerable. And I don't think we're the only people who've demonstrated good cohesion. But in this very divided country, and we are divided about almost everything, the mutual responsibility has been demonstrable, and that's helped us keep things as relatively good as they have been. In terms of coming out of it now, and we are coming out of it, apparently some parts of the school system are open. They're planning to open the rest of the school system maybe as early as Sunday. Malls are starting to reopen, things that seemed unthinkable. The beaches, not yet, and of course the airport, not yet. The downside, of course, is a terribly battered economy. And if the government is seen to have done well in terms of minimizing contagion, it is seen to have done less well in terms of giving people the grants and the loans that they need to keep their businesses going in an efficient manner. So there's a lot of criticism from the economic perspective of how the government has led this, alongside a great deal of praise for the practical measures to keep life alive. And maybe just one last thing, I don't want to speak for too long. Globally, I was really interested. I had an interview with an Israeli philosopher, Moshe Halbertal, and he made the point about this is a fine moment for humanity, in that we could have all kept our economies, trundling along, and who are the most vulnerable? Well, the elderly people. And the market could have said, well, too bad. The elderly people relatively don't contribute so much to the economy, so more of them will die. And broadly speaking, everywhere around the world, not everywhere, but most places, the market did not lead the response, and the kind of hard economic realities did not lead the response. Preserving life led the response. And that's, I'm not saying that as a Jewish thing, I'm saying that as a global thing pointed out by an Israeli philosopher. Again, a little crumb of comfort amid the nightmare.
You're right. I find that very comforting, and also looking at four of you in our different locations going through this crisis in our different ways, working to maintain our sense of community, and also and just to get through the day in our different ways is it's very moving to me, and it really stresses the point that while we may all be in different boats, we are weathering a very similar storm, and we're in it together. David, I hope you can tell us a little bit about what's happening in the medical tech world of Israel vis-a-vis a vaccine or treatment, and how that might play out.
Well, first of all, I can only give you sort of non-expert Times of Israel reported takes on this. There's a lot of very smart people in the relevant fields in Israel. They're working very hard. There are probably, I think Netanyahu said, 20 fairly serious vaccine efforts around the world. There's probably 5 that are, maybe have the best chance of succeeding. He wanted to think that some of the Israeli work was at the forefront of it, might be, able to deliver. I don't know that that's the case. In terms of treatments, again, a lot of Israelis at work. We know that I don't think Israel was the first to start using plasma of recuperated patients in the treatment of newly infected patients, but they've been doing that. And as I mentioned very briefly before, the government-funded biological research center that we have in a place called Nes Ziona, the defense minister announced that they were sort of first in the world with an antibody. That they're not the only people in the world with an antibody, but their antibody has aspects that are world leading. But still, even that has not been tested as of a few days ago. Hadn't been tested in animals, let alone in humans. So we're many months away. Where I think Israel has been smart is in terms of trying to minimize contagion, some of the digital tech on tracking. In terms of cures and vaccines, we're one of many countries trying very hard to find the path ahead. And I think it would be a mistake to suggest that we're on the doorstep of anything. I think we're making progress, but I don't think anyone thinks we're any less than months at the very best, several months away from any kind of dramatic, anything remotely comparable to a panacea. Thank
you. Now, we all touched on this a bit earlier, but I'm hoping that to get back to the issue of community. Kayleen, you mentioned the problem with losing Jewish summer camps. What are ways that Jewish people can stay connected during this time? I'm going to start with you on the question, but I'm opening this up also to Zeddy and Richard if they want to jump in as well.
I think that I think our community's done very well. I know that even in the education, I'll start with the education system. and let you know that we've talked to several of the Jewish Day Schools principals and executive directors, and they've not only learned how to engage with students virtually, but they've also learned new things about teaching them and their comprehension abilities in a virtual classroom. I can tell you that there's been lots of chat groups. The virtual online synagogues, I think that the synagogues have actually had a higher attendance for Shabbat services online than what they do on Shabbat services in person. And I think people are feeling more comfortable to go ahead and jump online and participate in chat groups. I know that the Atlanta Jewish Times, we have what we call the Atlanta Jewish Connector, which is an online community. It's almost like a small Facebook community. And this is one of the things that we've done to engage our community with one another and keep a hub of information on what to do, places to go, and at this time, where to connect.
Richard, Zeddy, are you noticing other trends that are similar in your communities as well?
I think what Kayleen says definitely rings true with me. The amount of times that I now attend a Havdalah service or attend a pre-Shabbat service is much more than I used to when we were living in the real world. So many shuls, so many organizations now continuing their activities online. And I just wanted to draw attention to one event that happened just last night here in Australia for Lag BaOmer. One of the rabbis here had the idea of getting 18,000 people online for 18 minutes at 1800 hours because it was the 18th of Iyar, Lag BaOmer. And the whole notion skyrocketed, and every organization and shul of every denomination within the community backed it. And we even got references from Israel. We got comments from Natan Sharansky, from Jonathan Sachs, from Chief Rabbi Ephraim Mervis. They all rallied behind this idea. It grew to such an extent. And so last night, rather than just get 18,000 Jews online at the same time, they managed to get 30,000 Jews online at the same time, listening to speeches, listening to music. So the way the community has adapted and embraced this virtual reality is just incredible, and it's testament to the power of the community and its will to survive.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add to that. It really has, and I alluded to this earlier, it's been a feast of Jewish culture the last 2 months. I haven't been to this many simchas in a long time. And there are so many bar mitzvah boys and bat mitzvah girls that are desperately disappointed. You know, they're not having this magical rite of passage. But there's been some extraordinarily emotional, wonderful social events that have been able to take place online, making the very best out of the very worst situation. All the movements have got events taking place nightly. I've taken part in one by the JLGB, which is one of the biggest groups. As I said, we do a podcast each week. We do a daily edition each day. And also, as was also mentioned, that I think more people are attending synagogue services now virtually than they ever did. In terms of actually personally turning up, simply because it's just an easy way to function, an easy way to embrace your Judaism. There is a great contradiction at the heart of British policy in terms of how we react to the virus. There are draconian rules still in place and have been for months about you're not allowed to see people outside your household, etc. Yet still there's no quarantine for people abroad coming into the UK, and that's not rolling out for another couple of weeks. So there's a lot of confusion and a lot of concern about government guidelines and Boris Johnson's role and performance in this crisis. But it's great to see how the Jewish community is responding and reacting and looking after people. One other thing that's just come to mind, the Board of Deputies, quarter of a millennium old organization here in the UK. It set up a vouchers scheme, so you can cut out a voucher and put it through people's letterboxes and volunteer to do their shopping, etc. You say it's that community spirit that's engendered, I think, in the Jewish community, and I try and reflect in the pages of the Jewish News each week.
David, there seems to be a growing rift between Israel and diaspora Jewish communities, but do you see this turning online and joining in for synagogue services and prayer forums? Do you see this as an opportunity to help bridge that divide between Jews in Israel and Jews throughout the world?
Well, I'm not sure the rift is growing, but I think there has been a rift, and this is an opportunity. And this why are we all obsessing about this? Because life is at stake, lives are at stake, and I think this is a lovely little event that we're doing now, and we're trying to explain what's going on in our different worlds. I would like to think that people watching this, at the very least, they got some insights. They may even have got a little bit of practical assistance, and I do think. The global Jewish community, it lacks, or it has lacked, avenues for dialogue. Well, we don't lack them. I think maybe some of them should be institutionalized. If you're talking about some of the big issues that are not virus related, there's long been too little communication. Things that Israel takes decisions about prayer at the Western Wall, and parts of the diaspora are horrified by them. There needs to be better dialogue. So. In this case, we don't have somebody on the call from South Africa, but Zeddy's stuff from Australia is very interesting. What were the things that Australia did and that the Australian Jewish community did that could help Jewish communities elsewhere? The same I'm interested to hear that the Board of Deputies, innovated and did something creative to encourage volunteerism. Are there lessons that other Jewish communities could have learned and could yet learn? We ran a story 2 weeks ago, I think, about South Africa's Jewish community, which seems to have been really, really smart. I think somebody in the communities, somebody very senior in the community's father or father-in-law is some kind of expert on epidemics or whatever, was called in, and they shut down very early. Excuse me. One of the results was there's an elderly care facility in Johannesburg with something like 400 people, but they locked down really early, and therefore they haven't had a single incident of contagion in that large facility. They certainly didn't have as of 2 weeks ago, and they were saying that their minyan was still going when all other synagogues in Johannesburg were closed down, and they were saying Kaddish for 1,000+ people, and they were doing naming ceremonies for baby girls during their Torah readings for people around the world because other shuls were closed down. I think if there were people who were smarter and quicker, and there was better communication, we might have helped the global community more than has happened, and we can maybe learn a lesson from that. So the big, long-standing differences within the community, sure, the more we can communicate, the better. And even on something like this, you see how essential good communication is.
Absolutely. And I'm actually curious for Richard, Zeddy, and Kayleen, how is Israel's government, the new government, playing out right now in the diaspora? Can you each speak a little bit to that? Richard, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, well, there is a huge divide in the UK between the left and the right. There always has. Now I'd say it's a gaping chasm. Of course, there are organisations on the left of our community, organisations like Na'amod, mainstream but still divisive communities like Yachad and NIF, who would never ever compliment Likud on anything they do. They would only want to see the back of them. But I think certainly the annexation issue and quite frankly, gobsmacking hypocrisy of Benny Gantz to facilitate the re-emergence of Benjamin Netanyahu for his own horse trading requirements are two areas that, and David writes about this perhaps better than anybody. I do recommend you read his stuff. Are two areas that I think have really truly upset the Jewish community here in the UK. My feeling has always been, and I'm a regular visitor to Israel, I go as often as I possibly can, sadly obviously not at the moment, is that the diaspora has always loved the Jews. The diaspora has always loved Israel. Israel hasn't terribly loved the diaspora, especially in the last 15 or 20 years. And I think that was really kind of brought into sharp focus a couple of weeks ago when Sir Mick Davis, who's a grandee of the Jewish community, one of the biggest philanthropists based in the UK, giving money to Israel, said that the morals of the Israeli parliament, the morals of the Knesset and the Israeli leaders violates the diaspora. It was an extraordinarily divisive thing that he said, caused a lot of friction in this community and split the community open wide in terms of its feelings towards Israel. It's very difficult, isn't it, when you criticize Israel? You want to do it amongst friends. You want to do it and from a place of love and support and a constructive place. But of course, you feel that if you say something out loud, it's going to be taken by Israel's enemies and manipulated. But I don't think that should stop you speaking truth, especially when it's a country that you identify with and you see yourself in. So yes, huge chasm of opinion currently in terms of Israel's direction and the mainstream British Jewish community.
So as far as the United States is concerned, I think that the Jewish community overall is very pro-Israel, and I think that the unity government is very interesting, and I think it's going to be something that I know our readers and our community is very interested in seeing exactly the benefits and as well as how Israel responds to it. I think that's the most interesting part about the way the government has gone. And in the U.S., people are either pro-Netanyahu or they're not. And I think seeing how Netanyahu forming the government, whether there's, and then seeing how Gantz kind of steps into a role, it's more of an anticipation for and our readers and just staying informed. I think a lot of our dual citizens here in the U.S. Got very, wanted to participate in the voting. That was one of the things that our readers was very interested in, is how, them flying to Israel to be a part of the voting and making sure that they had a voice.
Here in Australia, I can only really echo what Richard was saying beforehand about the chasm within the community between left and right. I think the vast majority of people who aren't really active but would consider themselves Zionist are actually just relieved that a unity government has formed, and that all the 3-4 elections, however many elections there were, have finally come to an end and things can actually move forwards. But I think those people who take an active interest in the politics of Israel are deeply divided. There are those on the right who are welcoming the fact that Netanyahu is back in power and who are congratulating the government on talking about annexation. And then there's a number of people on the left who are shocked by the talk of annexation and who are shocked that Netanyahu is still in power. And Israeli politics always reminds me, and debates about Israeli politics always remind me about the story of the yeshiva rowing crew who take on the Oxford boat team. And they can't understand why they lost the race so badly until one bright spark in the back of the room says, you know what? They have one person shouting and 8 people rowing. We have 8 people shouting and 1 person rowing. And then the Rosh Yeshiva says, you're right, we need a stronger rower. So there's a lot of people there who are shouting about it and who can't reach agreement, and they want their voices to be heard. And so there is this anger among certain elements within the community about what's happening in Israel. And there's particular anger over here in Australia. And David will appreciate this with the continuation of Yaakov Litzman in the government. Yaakov Litzman, who was the health minister, now moving over, I believe, to be housing minister. But here in Australia, Yaakov Litzman is persona non grata because he's been accused of interfering in the attempt to extradite Malka Leifer, who over here has been charged with 74 counts of child sexual abuse about 10 years ago. She fled the country. She's now in Israel. For the last 5 years, they've been trying to extradite her. And as health minister, Yaakov Litzman has been accused of interfering in that process to protect her. So over here, a lot of the comments that have come out with the formation of the government are, yes, we're relieved that a government has finally been formed, but why on earth is Yaakov Litzman, who the police have recommended for indictment, still serving in that government?
If I may...
Sorry, David. Just weigh in quickly, Richard. I just want to say, don't think that in Israel we're all of any unanimous opinion on pretty much anything. I mean, the staying alive and beating the virus, I think we all want to do that. But, the government and Gantz's decisions, he would argue just that he was saving Israel from yet a 4th election. and he just couldn't put us through that again. There are plenty of people who have a slightly different view of that, and I have certainly written, but I hope, in a nuanced way about it. And just very briefly on annexation, I don't know what they're going to do. Part of this is a function of the American government. The American government kind of says, go ahead, but doesn't quite say it. Mike Pompeo, astoundingly, you might think, has possibly delayed the formation of the government. I think they were going to swear it in on Wednesday, but because he's coming, they might only do it on Thursday. Now, is he coming to tell Netanyahu, just go ahead? You want to annex parts of the West Bank, that's fine with us? Or is he coming to say to Netanyahu, well, maybe you want to just backpedal a little on this? How is this going to hurt your relations with Jordan? Is this going to? We don't know. So just, as with so many things, there's a great deal of nuance. Litzman in Israel, obviously people are pretty aware of the Australian aspect to the stories, Eddie. In terms of what I said before about which part of the community has been the most hit, it was the ultra-Orthodox community. And part of that, a large part of that, was a failure of communication. He's the bloomin' health minister, for goodness sake, and it's his community. So there's a lot of criticism of him in that context. Anyway, he's chosen to head to the exits, but not exiting government.
I would say I imagine also there's a great sense of the clock running. November's election for the White House is looming. And there's every chance that the American voter will choose someone vaguely competent for the role rather than Trump. So they need to move on the annexation issue sooner rather than later. In terms of relationship between the diaspora, particularly the UK and Israel, one of the massive issues that I think a lot of our charities, particularly UJIA, is facing at the moment is youth disengagement with Israel. There has been a huge issue in the last 10 years or so of people in their teens through university and in their early 20s simply not having the same sort of engagement, the same sort of relationship, the same sort of Zionism and fervor that I had in my 80s and 90s when I was engaging with Israel through a youth movement. So I think that's something that they need to address. And also in terms of the wider community, when we see Israel do things that perhaps make us feel slightly uncomfortable, you have to remember that the British Jewish community have just come through the shadows of Corbynite anti-Semitism. 5 years where we lived off our wits, 5 years where we were so close to a prime minister of this country who had a willful blindness to anti-Semitism and surrounded himself with Jew haters. And he's only just disappeared now for a right and proper leader of the Labour Party. So you have to understand that was the atmosphere, I think, for the last 4 or 5 years for British Jews. So when we see Israel do things that we can't at dinner parties or at the school gates in all good conscience defend, it can be very, very difficult for Jewish people who have Israel in their heart to stand up for the Jewish state.
Well, it's remarkable for me to listen to all these answers and to feel like even from our different locations all over the world, we're sitting together at the same table having these conversations. And I think being connected through media is a really big part of that. And especially in the diaspora, it's helping him to maintain that sense of community, that sense of connection. And so as we begin to wrap up this conversation, I would like to hear more about what the general challenges facing media are in terms of revenue at this time, online and offline, in terms of reporting. How will this affect the long-term future of Jewish media? David, why don't we start with you?
Look, I think all media is having a very difficult time. We all know as editors, I'm sure everyone watching this as well knows, the transition from print media to the internet, the revenue that you bring in from page views is nothing compared to the revenue that you would get from paying for a print newspaper or subscribing to a print newspaper. And it's difficult. So, I fortunately have a partner who's been prepared to partner me in this project. We're trying to raise revenue with something called Times of Israel Community, where we invite people if they think that what we're doing is of value to them to help finance it. And I think that's the direction we've chosen to go, and we'd like to think it's a sustainable model. But doing original journalism, when you do original reporting, when you send reporters out, you're not just taking stuff that other people are reporting. It's a costly business. It's not a particularly well-paid profession. It's not as though journalists are earning large salaries. They're not, and therefore it's a challenge. I think it's incredibly important. I even think in this conversation, when we got towards the end of the conversation about the things that Israel does or defending Israel and so on, you know, if we had a long conversation, you know, we'd go back and forth between the editors about what are the things that Israel has done that are really untenable. You know, it's complicated. Israel's a tiny little country on the western edge of a largely hostile landmass, and you know, pretty directly threatened on almost every border. Not so simple. You know, the head of the Palestinian Authority, he's not Yasser Arafat. He's not directly orchestrating terrorism. He might be our best hope of a partnership, but his administration incites against Israel, and one of the consequences is ongoing violence against Israel. When we've relinquished adjacent territory, it's been used against us. Hezbollah, southern Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, and therefore it's complicated. And one of the reasons why we're here, and I can be very critical of Netanyahu, as anyone who reads the Times of Israel knows, but it's not all black and white. And he has, among other things, he's been battering away at some of our pillars of law enforcement, but he's kept this country relatively safe over the last few years. And therefore, it's complicated and it's nuanced. And that's the value of all of our publications. If we can enable people to understand and give them depth, it's a complicated business. It requires real intellectual honesty and constant reassessment and fair-mindedness. So I don't have magical formulas for how to go about survival, and all of my colleagues here have their particular issues that they're grappling with. But the need for it, for giving people credible information that's reported with the best intentions, with an effort to enable people to understand, I think it's absolutely critical. And I only hope that we will all find in our different ways the mechanisms to make sure that we do continue to thrive.
Amen. Richard, what's going on? What do you think will be the future of Jewish media, and what are the challenges you're facing right now?
Well, as David will tell you, I think the days of building a business on print are long gone. It was hard making a profit out of a newspaper 20 years ago. It's nigh on impossible now. News is what you don't know that you need to know. So print simply can't keep up with a weekly newspaper. Sometimes we're printing news that's 2, 3, 4 days old. By any standard, that perhaps isn't news. So does that mean you immediately abandon dead trees for digital? No, I think ours will be the last to go. I think the Jewish community loves its print. It values advertising in print. We have a captive audience, and we do need to sustain that audience and be loyal to that audience and serve them. A lot of them don't go online, some of the more elderly ones who love and consume our products. But the future has to be built on digital. It has to be built on brands for a digital platform, events, special one-off publications, and finally relinquishing, turning the tap off of that print revenue stream that will only be there for so long. And you have to have in place plan B. So when finally it all dries up on print, and obviously people have been speaking about the decline and death of print for many years. As I said, it'll be a couple of years away yet, but we need to make sure that our house is in good order when finally we have to make that move.
Kayleen, what about you? What do you think about the future of Jewish media?
You know, I think that with respect to print newspaper media, I think the Jewish newsprint, we're pretty lucky for the simple fact that, and I agree with Richard, is our community definitely wants a newspaper. They want to get their Jewish newspaper. When they don't get it, our phones ring off the hook. And I think that we've had to challenge our business model and making sure that we are changing with the ways. We recently went from a weekly publication to printing twice a month, which, because of the digital times, where if you want breaking news, you're going to go online, and that's where you're going to get your breaking news. So we have taken our personal interest stories, things about the community that are interesting that you may not know about some of our leaders and the organizations. And we're putting that in print, and we're spending more time in our investigative reporting. and having more comprehensive stories. And honestly, our revenue went up 18% last year. And that's because we changed the way that we are publishing our paper and what we're putting in it. We're making sure that we're having more diverse content where we're reaching a larger audience. You know, where we have academic, we have, I call it what we have our meat and potatoes as well as our dessert. And that's, you know, making sure that we're talking about the news and we're talking about the academics, but then we also have the fun stuff, the Simcas and the personal interest stories. So I think, you know, I don't foresee the Atlanta Jewish Times being in any jeopardy in the near 10 years. I definitely think that we have to be challenged to engage our readers and making sure that we are staying in tune with them and keeping our finger on what it is that's going to interest them that they can't get at the fingertips right now online. And that brings me to my last challenge, which is, you know, beefing up our online presence. You know, the COVID has kicked us into at a whole new level that we've never been before. And the results have shown that. Our numbers have doubled in the last 3 months for our online presence. And so I think that our challenge is just being adaptive and doing a better job and turning out the content that our readers really want to see and that's going to engage them.
Thanks, Kayleen. And Zenny, what about you? What are the challenges you see the media facing? How are you meeting those challenges, and what are your thoughts about the future?
Well, I think Richard made an interesting point about people for years have been predicting the end of print journalism, and yet we're still here. You know, 20 years ago on the very same day, Richard and I started at a new website called totallyjewish.com. It was the first Jewish website in Europe. And we were the enfants terribles. We were the terrible children who were going to upend and uproot Jewish journalism, turn it on its head. The future of print journalism, the Jewish Chronicle and all these established newspapers was over as far as we were concerned because the internet was the new thing. 20 years on, we're both editors of mainstream Jewish newspapers. We've become exactly the thing that we set out to destroy. So print journalism has survived. And as Kayleen said, there are still readers out there who want a print publication, and they ring up furiously if their delivery is delayed each week. You know, I always say that the Australian Jewish News, or any Jewish news, any Jewish newspaper, is one of the staples of the Friday night dinner table. It's there with your challah, it's there with your Kiddush wine. People want something physical to read, and it's one of those things that unites the community. Of course, I'm not saying that we're not challenged, we're not threatened. Obviously, like every newspaper in the world, we've seen a drop-off in readership because some people are moving onto the internet, and because, as Richard alluded to earlier, there's a disengagement within the community of younger generations. They're not as engaged with Israel as they used to be. They're not as engaged with the Jewish community. So we have to find ways to appeal to those. And obviously going online, going digital is one of the ways we try and address that. The partnership we formed last year with the Times of Israel, trying to tackle our digital presence and making us more of an online product, more of an online brand, is something that we are now aiming to do. And the question is, like every online publication, how do we monetize that? How do we attract readers? And how do we make that our core readership moving forwards? So while I don't think that a print publication is going to die out in the next 5 years or 10 years, I think obviously there has to be a shift to a digital presence and finding a way to make that your core readership and finding the way to monetize that.
Lots of challenges ahead and lots of opportunities. People turn to the media for a story, and certainly COVID-19 has taken over our thoughts and our feelings, and it's one of the main reasons why we check in. But I'm wondering if each of you could tell me what your favorite story this week has been that your newspaper has published. What's moved you, what's inspired you, and what can inspire us going forward? Why don't we start with Richard?
Well, it's only Monday. You expected me to find a story that's inspired me in one day. Well, luckily, I can give you that story. So, as I said, there's been a lot of consternation about the ability of this government to inform the population and supply PPE. There's a story that we broke today about the largest care provider in terms of care homes for the Jewish community that was assured personal protective equipment by the government, and has told us today that the government has failed them. So that's got huge implications in terms of healthcare and preparedness for Jewish care homes in the UK. So as we stand here with only one day down in the week, if I was to put the paper to bed, as it were, this evening, we'd run with that on our front page.
Is it only Monday? It's amazing how COVID-19 time is just blended. It's hard to keep track of the days. Yes, so it is only Monday, and this is the beginning of the week. We're actually 2 days into the week here in Israel. So your favorite story within the last week, I'll broaden that out. Maybe that story comes from today, or maybe it comes from a few days ago. Kayleen, what has been the story that's moved you most?
I mean, there's been several, especially over the Mother's Day holiday. We had our readers write in to tell us why their mother deserved the best. So those are always great stories to publish because the community loves them. They want the families share them. But I got to tell you, the story that really inspired me the most was it's titled "Not My Time to Die," and it's a story of one of our community members, Dr. Tony Levitis, is a psychologist here in Atlanta that had treated a patient, and the patient had contacted him and told him that he had tested positive for COVID. 6 days later, Dr. Levitis was in the hospital, and he almost died. He was in the hospital for a month with no family, nobody there to visit him. The point of the story that is so uplifting, inspiring, is that he beat the COVID. He was victorious over it. And I was very happy that he agreed to share his story and his victory with our community. And that was, if you look on our website, it is our lead story as of today.
I saw it. I thought I was incredibly touched by it, and I was hoping that you would share that one. Zeddy, what's been the story that's moved you the most?
First of all, can I just say I'm a bit shocked that everybody thinks it's Monday. As far as I'm concerned, it's almost 7 o'clock on Tuesday morning here. I'm going to take a slightly different tack and talk about a story that isn't directly related to the coronavirus. This is just a nice story. A woman in her 90s whose husband passed away a few years ago was flicking through our newspaper a few weeks ago. And as she was flicking through and looking at the photos of people at different events, she spotted in one of the photos a guy she dated 80 years ago back in Europe. And she hadn't seen him since. And she got in touch with him, and they are now communicating again, albeit via Zoom in the current climate. But it's so nice that as a newspaper, we've been able to bring together these childhood sweethearts who haven't seen each other for 70 or 80 years, who are now re-establishing a relationship. And I just think that's a heartwarming story, not only that they've come together again, but also that this couple in their 90s are carrying out their relationship and rebuilding their friendship via Zoom. It shows just how the community and how society is changing.
Oh, I love it. You made my day. I think that's an incredible story, and I look forward to reading it. David, what story has moved you the most in the last few days?
Well, I'm a very hard-hearted person, so I'm having trouble to think of stuff that's really moved me. There's a couple of things that I would just highlight. First of all, we've had a lot of blogs about Mother's Day, including one by our Jewish Times editor, Amanda Dan, and her Mother's Day present to herself, which I think is worth reading. And often the blogs bring stories that touch an emotional chord that hard reporting doesn't. And just the other thing that I would highlight, and we've done, I mean, I could tell you about the lions, the rare lion births at Jerusalem Zoo. There's some nice stuff like that. There's this guy who's been on a boat off the coast of Jamaica, an Israeli on his boat off the coast of Jamaica for several weeks, and slowly, losing the plot a little bit by the sound of it. He got allowed to dock in Jamaica today after weeks of negotiations because they're locked down, obviously. And just one other, the nicer things that we've done in the last few weeks, we've run this series of pieces that are all headlined "Locked Down?" ? Open up to ... which is kind of highlighting Jewish and Israeli cultural innovators and musicians and playwrights and artists and so on. And there's some really, really lovely stuff in that. And one of the other benefits of running this series is that it's given our reporters, who are often, dealing with stuff that's not uplifting and doesn't move their souls. This is people writing about arts and culture stuff that inspires them and moves them, and you feel that in the writing. So those pieces have been cathartic for the writers, and I think uplifting for the readers. And maybe just one last thing I want to come back on about what Richard was saying about the hub. Running a newspaper without people in the office, and you always feel that you need that newsroom. I really think you do. I think it's true. We've all managed, and we've managed astoundingly well, actually. And people have been incredibly motivated, and I don't know how they've done it, including members of my own staff. I mean, one of my reporters, he's married to a nurse. He's got 3 young kids at home. Somehow he's covering, Israeli politics, which is an absolute joy from morning to night. Somehow he's done it. I think we're going slightly crazy without the interaction. So yeah, it's an amazing thing that we held it together, and we've shown that we could, but I don't think we should delude ourselves. I think we've maintained a semblance of sanity for 75 minutes on this call, but I think all of humanity is losing it to some extent, and we do need the interaction at the office and in life. This is not how I want to carry on living my life. It's great that we found ways to deal with it. Kol hakavod to the world Jewish community, but please, the sooner this is over, let's get those best minds finding the vaccines, finding the cure, and I don't know, let's do a global conference. We'll get together in each other's capitals every year or so. But I'd like us to actually get back together sooner rather than later.
David, I'm 100% with you on that. I miss human contact. I miss being in the same room and sharing that space. But luckily, we do have these platforms, and we do have this opportunity to connect. But I remember during the Passover Seder this year, we said next year in Jerusalem, but we also said next year together in person with the people that we love. But I'm also very grateful for this kind of opportunity, which we may not have explored prior to COVID-19. And this is a wonderful chance for all of us to come together from our different communities and talk about the challenges and the opportunities that we're facing. And Shock AV is the platform that's been hosting us. They've done a remarkable job keeping all of us together and putting on this event. And so thank you to Shock AV. And thank you, Kayleen and Richard, Zeddy, and David for tuning in and speaking with us. And thank you for all of you around the world, from all over the globe, from across these different time zones, from Monday and Tuesday, for being here and sharing this time with us, and for making this so special. So I want to wish all of you who are into the evening a wonderful night. And for all of you who are just waking up on the other side of the world, good morning and good afternoon to everyone in between. And may we all meet soon in each other's capitals, in each other's offices, and by the water cooler. And until then, let's stay connected here as best we can. So thank you so much, everybody, and have a wonderful, wonderful day, night, wherever you are.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everybody.